Good evening, and welcome to the 8th session of our award-winning Visionary Conversation Series for 2012-2013. My name is David Barnard, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Manitoba, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I would like to thank the University of Manitoba Alumni Association for its partnership in sponsoring this and all of our Visionary Conversations. I'd like to welcome each of you here. We have a number of special guests here, people who represent some of the partner organizations that we work with. Really pleased to have you. I also want to acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory here on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This university, this city, sit at the crossroads of the Anishinaabe, Métis, Cree, Dakota, and Oji-Cree nations. The University of Manitoba is a special place with remarkable people who dare to defy convention and carve new paths in many different ways. And this Visionary Conversation Series gives us an opportunity to share the spirit of our students, faculty, and alumni. Tonight we're discussing the arts, the foundation of a vibrant community. And I would think from the buzz of conversation outside the room before we get started that it's going to be vibrant. When we use the phrase, as we have been in our university branding, where we are shapes who we are, the arts communities of Winnipeg and of the University of Manitoba often come to mind. Our city and our university have nurtured artists whose work has been celebrated locally, nationally, and internationally. The Royal Winnipeg Ballet, the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre, the Winnipeg Art Gallery, the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, the folk and jazz festivals, other things, iconic and enduring local institutions. And we're proud of the extent to which the University of Manitoba is engaged in the community with these various things. Tonight we're privileged to be joined by an outstanding panel of artists and scholars to lead our conversation. And we want you, the audience, to be active participants in this evening. So each of the panelists will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, commenting on tonight's discussion theme. They may be using some visual images that'll be on the overhead screens. And then when they've finished, we'll have a conversation between the audience and the panelists. We'll have some wireless microphones circulating. When we recognize you, I'd ask you to wait until the microphone is near you because we're taping the proceedings. I'll indicate which question we'll take next. We want to get as many audience members to participate as possible, so I'd ask you to be brief as you make your comments and ask your questions. We advertised we'll be done by 8:30, so we'll be done by 8:30. About 25 minutes after 8, I'll ask Pat Bovey, the Vice Chair of the University's Board of Governors, to sum up. Pat is a well-known figure in the arts community here in Winnipeg, and we're really pleased that she's agreed to provide the summary tonight. So to the panel. We're really pleased tonight that one of our distinguished alumni, Jeff Melanson, has joined us for this discussion. Jeff is president of the Banff Centre. He holds a Bachelor of Music degree from this university and an MBA from Wilfrid Laurier. Before joining the Banff Centre, he was executive director and co-chief executive officer of Canada's National Ballet School. While he was there, he was instrumental in eliminating the ballet's operating deficit. Come and work for us. We don't have a deficit, but we can always use help. And increasing annual revenues by 50%, even better. Jeff's a member of a number of important arts organizations, was named as one of Canada's top 40 under 40 in 2009. Please welcome Jeff.
So when I told my staff that I was only going to talk for 7 minutes, most of them laughed, so I wrote my speech on a very, very small piece of paper to try to keep my comments short. Thank you very much for that gracious welcome. It's a delight to be back in Winnipeg. This is the first time for me professionally that I've been back here on a work-related trip. Other times it's just been to go to the cottage and such, so great to be back. Want to try to be a little bit provocative in the 5 to 7 minutes that I have here with you. The arts sector for me is fundamental, like really what we're talking about in terms of the foundation of a society. It really is more than that. It's a foundation of every individual life. The arts are all an extension of natural process. They're part of our bodies, part of our souls, part of our spirit, and awakening that creative potential in everyone is really first and foremost. I think we have challenges in that as a sector we feel that external people, particularly government funders and private sector supporters, do not value the innate nature of what we do and the importance of it. But also I think as a sector we've done a pretty poor job of advocating for ourselves and of really making the connections within our society. So first and foremost, culture as innate. If you talk to many artists, and I've got to speak more often than I should probably at art service organizations nationally, and share the notion that everyone is an artist, that is a very disruptive thought. And I have been stoned, not stoned literally, but almost, by the arts community for ever making that suggestion. And the parallel I'd like to draw for people is if you enter a room like we did tonight, and I ask how many of you are runners, many of you will put up your hand. If I ask how many of you are artists, very few people will typically. Actually, this is an unusual crowd, so maybe a lot would. But typically not many people will, because we've kind of defined the arts and artistry as being something that is it's a professional calling. If you're not earning a living doing it, then you're not an artist. And I think that's a really dysfunctional way to look at arts and creativity, and certainly a fairly modern way of interpreting creative practice. Importantly in our society, we're going through some fairly radical changes. If you pay attention to any government discourse around the social and economic structures that underpin our societies, a lot of the value proposition that we bought into 20, 25 years ago is not holding up at this point. I remember being a young student in grade 12 at Silver Heights Collegiate in St. James and meeting the guidance counselor and being told because I was good at math, I should be an actuary, because an actuary would pay well and would be a low-stress job. And this was around the same time, some of you will remember, Freedom 55 was the big thing, which is a very strange way to look at building a society. The notion of building a society where your sole aim is to do as little work as possible and retire as soon as possible and sit on a beach and relax is a very strange way to look at Canada, and certainly as a young nation that was built by pioneers, very strange. When we look at these social discussions in terms of how we construct Canada, how we construct our municipalities and our provincial orientations, there is a real opportunity for arts and culture to step up and drive change and drive purpose and to really help people reimagine the notion of novelty, of experimentation, of risk-taking. That is what we do in the arts and culture sector. That's what we do at the Banff Centre. We have 4,000 artists that come to the centre every year who imagine something that does not exist and make it happen. That's what artists do. That is what we need in our society. And increasingly we're finding within the business community a real openness to this. Largely driven, as I mentioned earlier today, to some music students by the success of a company like Apple. Apple, which has brought together technologists, designers, architects, linguists in some cases to reimagine business process, and really has created quite a robust corporation. Huge opportunities for us in the business world. So the notion that art should stay in their silo and not play a role there is wrong. In terms of the arts themselves, there are many, many questions about how we are funded and how we renew the sector. As someone running a large dinosaur organization that's celebrating its 80th anniversary, we have a big responsibility as old organizations to change, to serve as platforms for new ideas and disruptive change with arts and culture. Sometimes that means turning over large-scale platforms like the Banff Centre to the disruptive artists who will do different things that will be very out of sync with what we've done historically. That is really, really important for us. So as a sector, I think we have to look very seriously at ourselves in terms of what we offer and to what extent we are providing the new voices, the emerging talent in our sector with the opportunities to affect change. In the K-12 education system, many of you will have seen, just by show of hands, the Ken Robinson talk on creativity being killed in schools. Most of you probably have seen this. We've created a school system that measures kids on one or two attributes and then defines them as geniuses or not, or slow kids or the advanced. That's not the way our school system should be built. We've known this since 1983, the multiple intelligences theory, the approach to education, where really it should be broad enough. Oh, the 5-minute sign's up already? Oh, I knew that was going to happen. So I only have 5 more minutes to talk to you. No, I know that's not true. Anyhow, more we can do. The K-12 system should be about breadth and diversity. The arts sector represents that, really awakening each individual child's innate capacity, their levels of interest, and so on. We can play a role there and such. What I would just close by saying is the arts sector should be about risk. It should be about innovation. Because we are underfunded, because we feel cash-starved, we do not take chances. We are not supposed to, and in fact, if you look historically at all of the great artists that we admire, we look up to, these were people who took risks, who often had the chance to revise a work many times over. We have created a very strange sense within our arts community that everything we produce should be a hit. That cannot be the case, and in fact, we should encourage audiences to come to things that they will hate, and they are allowed to hate it, and being provoked in that way and asking them to think about what they didn't like and how they interface with it is really important. We have to enable our arts sector to take those profound risks. A city like Winnipeg with a collaborative spirit, and really when I moved to Toronto from Winnipeg, people would say, I would do things like find two organizations doing the same thing and say, it seems to me you're both doing the same thing. Maybe you should talk to each other. And in Toronto, in Winnipeg, that's just assumed. In Toronto, that was a genius, brilliant idea. So what I'm saying to you is, as an arts community in Winnipeg, you have a real opportunity to build on that collaborative spirit. Please do invest in your arts organizations as audience members, as governments, as donors. Allow your artists, your leaders to take risks, to fail, to fall. That is what we do. That is what the world requires of us. And in terms of reimagining society, reimagining the role creativity plays therein, we need to be enabled to take those risks, to really be bold and brazen and to step forward. I think that's probably my last 2 minutes, so I will thank you and turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Jeff. Our second speaker is Edmund Daw, Dean of the Desautels Faculty of Music. His career includes a wide range of professional activities as a solo and collaborative pianist, administrator, teacher, adjudicator, keynote speaker, and lecturer. He's performed around the world. His performances are frequently featured on national CBC broadcasts. His recording Sonatas was nominated for an East Coast Music Award. Dialogue, his fourth CD, was released just last year. And just last year, he began his second term as Dean. Please join me in welcoming Edmund Daw.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's so wonderful to see this turnout. What exactly is music's role in building a vibrant community? I'm going to begin tonight with a very ancient quote from Plato's The Republic. Musical training is a more potent instrument than any other because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul. One of my favorite quotes in all of the literature. I'm told that the ancient Greek text translated here as soul is also the word for psyche, for being. So what is it about music that enables it to do that to the most inward places of the soul or the psyche? Music remains one of the most powerful and adaptable forms of human expression. An international hit song can inspire and move millions. Music can rally a nation during times of war. It can console during life's worst moments. A catchy jingle can help turn a product into a multi-million-dollar profit. And it's hard to find a blockbuster movie that does not have an equally blockbuster film score. Music is an integral part of the fabric of our community. Most people like some style of music. There's so much of it that I'm often reminded of a quote by the famous Russian pianist-composer Rachmaninoff, who said, "Music is enough for a lifetime, but a lifetime isn't enough for music." Music also represents a vast, evolving, often struggling, but important industry. Estimates vary, but when you consider the components and the broader list of music-related sectors, including consumer electronics, advertising, and musical instruments, the estimated value of the industry is huge in terms of its contribution to a vibrant community. And what about the musician in the community? Jeff has already said that artists are creative, innovative risk takers, but they are also collaborators. Artistic success in music is often founded on solid principles of good community. Each member of the group contributes his or her gifts to achieving a unified and exciting artistic interpretation. Musicians work in and build communities. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to go it alone as a musician. They are key players in what perhaps Richard Florida would call the clustering force in his creative economy. And music is certainly a force in this community of Winnipeg, a city which has slightly over 2% of Canada's population, but approximately 12% of Canada's musicians. Music offers a unique window on the human condition and experience. For generations, it has been an important form of social commentary and in so many ways a socio-political barometer of our community. And finally, I believe that this art form we call music is increasingly becoming a springboard for exciting possibilities in the area of scientific research. More and more, music is being seen as a key player in helping understand and sustain not only a vibrant but a healthy community. My second and final quote is from Dr. Oliver Sacks, professor of neurology and author, New York University School of Medicine. And he says, when Music in the Brain was published in 1977, functional brain imaging still lay in the future. In the last 20 years, there have been huge advances here, but we have as yet scarcely touched the question of why music has so much power. It is a question that goes to the heart of being human. So in this regard, I've presented you with the Plato and with Dr. Sacks, and it's sort of bookends in time, as it were, talking about the power of music. And again, in this regard, I'll leave you with a recent and very personal story about the impact of music, the things we know, and the many things we have yet to discover. My mother is 81 years old and currently battling dementia. She lives in Newfoundland, close to my brother, who recently retired and spends quite a lot of time with her every day. During one of my visits in mid-December, we were having a slow day. In fact, there were 2 occasions that day where I was not convinced that she knew who I was. That evening, my brother Gary and I were watching a rerun of a PBS broadcast featuring reunions of male vocal quartets that had hit songs in the 1950s. Might not have been a terribly exciting show for my brother and I, but one group I had never heard walked onto the stage and started to perform their one song that had made it to the top of the charts for several weeks in 1950. My mother was 19 years old at the time. So, as they started to sing, she smiled, joined in, singing every note, every word, every nuance, tapping the beat with her finger through the entire song. My brother and I were dumbfounded because not only had we never heard this song, we had absolutely never heard my mother sing it. And she played piano and sang her whole life. The song ended and my mother sat there with a huge smile on her face. The show was over, my brother left, and literally about 10 minutes after he left, I made a comment that we had had a wonderful evening together with Gary, but once more the puzzle look returned, and she responded, "Gary? No, I haven't seen him in a long time." So like Plato, I believe that music does indeed find its way into the inward places of the human psyche. As the study and performance of music enables us to learn more and more about those inward places, we will continue here at the University of Manitoba in the vibrant community of Winnipeg to make, I believe, great strides in understanding and experiencing more fully the essentials of a vibrant community. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Our next panelist is Paul Hess. Paul's originally from Toronto. He studied at the University of Guelph, received his Master of Fine Arts degree from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in 1978. His paintings and photographs have been on display in various centres across Canada since the mid-1970s. In 1987, he was appointed to the faculty at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver. He held various teaching and administrative responsibilities there, including serving as Dean of Media Arts. In 2008, he was appointed Director of the School of Art at the University of Manitoba. And in these last several years, Paul's vision of what space could be and what it could mean for producing art has helped guide us into our wonderful new art lab. Please join me in welcoming Paul Hess.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks, David. Tonight, I want to sort of do a mini lecture, a mini art history lecture, and then I want to turn it inside out. We've been talking a lot about. I'm thinking of, as I'm doing this, I'm thinking of a Toronto joke to get back at Jeff for the Toronto cracks, because David introduced me as somebody from Toronto. But what I want to look at, what I want to talk about tonight is this notion of what I want to call making and what I want to call looking. What I mean by that is the relationship that you play between art that you look at and the audience role that you play. And then I want to try to go somewhere with that. When I use the term art, I mean everything is art if the artist says it is, which is a famous mantra from the 60s. Whether it's good or bad, that's not the point. When I'm talking about audiences, I want you to think about audiences in the plural, because there isn't one audience, there are many diverse audiences. And the other term is reception, which is the idea of experience of looking or receiving information. And what I need for that is to actually activate you. So am I going backwards? I'm going backwards. So let me start with this. An image that I'm sure you're familiar with, so I won't introduce it. And what I want to say is that an Andy Warhol show is coming to town this summer. It will be on view in any medium to large size city in North America, because that's often the case. Andy Warhol's work is used very often as a summer blockbuster show to draw in audiences to galleries in various centers across North America. Now, the thing about Warhol that's interesting is that you know this either as Marilyn Monroe or as Andy Warhol. And so it creates a kind of a dilemma around what it is that you experience and how you experience it. If you know less about art history, it's Marilyn Monroe. And if you know more about art history or about art, it's Andy Warhol. Another image is what's called Triple Elvis. Now, the interesting thing about Triple Elvis is that it's one of my favorite Warhol images. I do have Warhol images that I like. But I think the interesting thing about this one is that the subject is cloaked in the kind of process that made Warhol famous, a kind of a factory environment, a technological use of screen printing, silk screen printing, and then photo reproducibility, which was a big thing in the 60s. So what this starts to tell me is, and tell you perhaps, is that we don't really look at art from the point of view of the subject. It's the point of view of the person that's making this, the kind of things that they do, the ways that they use materials and media. And that's what one of the drivers is that sort of becomes a hallmark of the last 100 years of art. And we no longer look at it with this cliche notion of open eyes. There are no longer open eyes in that sense in which we have used that cliche. But at this point, I want to digress a little bit and talk about something that's traditionally what people understand as reception of art, which starts with an image of the Louvre and moves us into this very historically driven art gallery experience, museum experience. And then it moves in to take a very close look at a particular artwork, in this case Vermeer's The Astrologer, which is one of the paintings on view at the Louvre. Now, it looks very huge in this context, and in an art history lecture, this would be really large, but the painting really is only about this big. It's a very, very small panel on wood. And then there's this experience as well, which is the mythology of the artist working in the studio. And this is not what I presented with Warhol, and it's not what you might think of as Warhol, because that's a kind of a behind-the-scenes look. But the key thing about this and about this idea, and this is Giacometti painting in his studio in 1954. And so this is what traditionally people imagine artists do. They sit still, they have a subject, the subject is positioned in proximity, and so on. And they make something out of that experience. So I'll flip it again, and I'll switch to this image, which has become, in a kind of a sense, a kind of a cliche of its own within American contemporary painting, which is Hans Demuth's photographs that were made as a series in 1951 of Pollock, Jackson Pollock, painting these abstract expressionist paintings. And the amazing thing about these photographs is that they were staged. The amazing thing about these photographs is that the artist worked collaboratively with the photographer to produce this series of work. But what happened with this work is it completely reversed the terms. So from this point on, the exposure of the artist in the studio was given over to process and not subject, and it completely inverted the terms. So what's really amazing about this work is that this became the hallmark from 1951 forward of what people imagined artists did. So no longer was it an easel painting. There was this guy with a can of paint throwing it around on the floor. So it really marginalized the stereotype and radicalized the stereotype. It made it harder for audiences to comprehend why this could be art and how would this fit into a museum like the Louvre. It deconstructed the process, but then there was this. And this happened in 1917. So this is Marcel Duchamp. who is a very radical artist, for those of you that don't know him. He stopped working as an artist around this time. He was rejected by the Parisian artists of his generation, which is the early decades of the 20th century. And this work was considered in got the date here, I don't remember the date, in 2008, article by The Independent in the UK as being the most important work of art of the 20th century. Let me give you two interesting facts about this work. This work was never actually exhibited, and it doesn't exist. It only existed for the sake of the photograph. When it was dropped off at the show in 1917, the Society of Independent Artists in New York City, it was put behind a curtain, and it never was shown. What's interesting about this image that you're seeing is that this photograph was made by Alfred Stieglitz, a very famous American photographer of the mid-20th century. So this is the only record that we have of the most famous artwork of the 20th century. It was never shown in the exhibit, and it doesn't exist. Pause for a joke. So the joke then becomes, how does that work? And this is, I want to just draw your attention to this. This is a 1935 book cover of Cubism and Abstract Art by Alfred H. Bard, Jr. I think I've got the initial right. Who was the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which, as you know, or as you may know, is one of the most important 20th century museums and collections of contemporary modernist American art. And this actually is a kind of a lineage of patrimony, a lineage of art from generation to generation, from movement to movement and place to place, which sets a trajectory into play. Now, this may seem kind of normal, but at the time it was quite extraordinary. The interesting thing about this image is that Barr was able, through this kind of mechanism and through the shows at the Museum of Modern Art, to actually have this become a kind of a canon in its own right. So it became the modernist canon. And so typically with something like this, what is going on is that there are exclusions and inclusions. And this is the key thing. So there is this sense of who is in and who is out. And this is a challenge as well. Following on who is in and who is out, I thought just for humorous effect I would throw this up, which is a Greg Curnow image from his extraordinary body of work, which is worth investigating if you can. Anybody see what's wrong with this map? Yes, and there's more than no Florida. There's no United States of America. So this is at a time when Canadian art fortunes were rising, the inception of the centennial year and so on. There were a whole range of pro-Canadian efforts in terms of publishing, and Arts Canada was born, and a whole range of flourishing of the arts in Canada. And so Curnow was an avowed Canadianist, and a lot of work that he made was kind of blogs or attacks on the various things that occurred that way. I'll put another puzzle up. This is a sculptor, a well-known American sculptor named Richard Serra. This is a piece called Tilted Arc from the late 80s and early 90s. And this work no longer exists. It's no longer a work of art, and it no longer exists. I'll put it that way. The reason I say it in that order, because it's a work of public art that was installed in New York. And as soon as it was installed, the people that worked in the federal building that was right next to it went crazy. They hated it. It's huge. Corten steel, looks rusty, like a rusty big piece of metal. And the problem with this is it meant that they had to walk around it to get in and out of the parking lot and off and on the sidewalk and so on. It drove them crazy because it phenomenologically, in terms of their experience of walking, disrupted everything. So immediately when it went up, everybody went crazy. People wanted it taken down. And after a court trial that involved artists and experts and the public and the people that were upset, it was quietly dismantled in the late 1980s and taken to a warehouse in Maryland and left there. And so Serra argued that all along, if the work was dismantled because it was called site-specific, meant it had to exist only as art in that place. If it was taken apart, it couldn't be an artwork and it couldn't exist. So the only thing, again, existing for this is the documentation. So here we're back to this kind of photographic record. So this was one of the most famous controversies around public art in the world at the time. There have been other ones, but this is one of the most interesting ones because there was a huge court trial. So there's a public record. Two more images to go. One, this is by Jeff Wall, a Vancouver photographer artist. This is called Picture for Women from 1979. This sat in the other end of the studio that I worked in Vancouver at that time. It was the Perel building on Hastings across from the Woodwards building. And Jeff was working on this piece and other pieces at that time. What's interesting about this piece is that it's a backlit transparency. It exists at a large image that's fluorescently lit as a transparency, kind of what you see in airports for advertising. So it uses the mechanism of advertising. It uses the rear projection light of cinema. It's a staged photograph. It's shot with traditional view camera techniques, and it's printed, using high-tech technology to produce images from the late 20th century. And so it's this amazing conflation or mixing up, colliding, if you will, of all these different kinds of art modes, social conditions, and art history, because this is actually based on a very famous Edouard Manet painting that you can see in Paris I think it's in Paris. I forget now. But it's this painting, a bar at the Folies Bergère. The reason I want to show you this is because really, the late 20th century and the early 21st century present alternative ways of looking at notions of subject. It's in some sense a revival of the subject. It changes the way you look at this because it's highly realistic. It's no longer really abstract anymore. And it invites you in because it uses devices like your experience of cinema to begin to understand it, to learn how to look at it. So it's a very interesting picture for a number of ways that way. He is a meticulous perfectionist. He will shoot 1,000 images of something like this in order to pick the one that works for him. And he uses actors, assistants, and so on. So it's done like a movie production. The work to produce this is like a movie piece. The last image I want to show you is of a fairly recent work called Pole from 2001. It's a color photograph by a German artist named Thomas Demand. And if you know this work, you'll know you'll anticipate what I'm going to say. But if you don't know, let me try to describe what you're looking at. This is a color photograph of a staged construction in a studio that he works in, his own studio. And what he's done is he's meticulously recreated a media photograph, which is often his modus operandi. And what he does is he'll take a media photograph that has a kind of a political or a socially controversial circumstance. And what he'll do is meticulously construct using colored paper and cardboard a scene like this, which will then be photographed. So he'll build the 3D set as a paper sculpture, photograph this, and then destroy the sculpture. So this, what you see doesn't exist anymore. It existed for the sake of the photograph. So it uses that strange quality of the camera that is the witness of what you have seen. And then the artist removes what you have seen in order to leave this as a kind of a residue of the work. This is of the Florida recount, that famous moment when the ballots in Florida, the hanging chads, created the overloaded controversy that required the Supreme Court of the United States to rule on whether the votes could be counted and how. The work was created between the November election and the inauguration in January. And this is kind of how he works. The most recent piece he did was Whitney Houston's last meal from the hotel room. He actually booked himself into the room. But of course, the room wasn't the room, if you understand my use of that term. And what he did was he then kind of just experienced it and then used media photographs that he found to recreate that experience. So, where am I in all this, and what is missing from all this? This is just a little moment of what happens in what I represent, which is the art school at the University of Manitoba. And what's missing is a lot of things. There is no work of women artists in this group. There is no work of Indigenous artists in this group. There are lots of things missing, but I'll mention those too. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because I've lulled you into this kind of situation where this is the kind of thing that students experience when they begin to study art. They learn about all these really strange things that people do. And I'm glad that Jeff went first because it took a little bit of explanation that will help me in what I have to explain. My problem is, how do I make an art school respond to this kind of history? This is approximately about 100 years of art history that I've shown you in various guises. And so the challenge that I have is, how do I motivate students to get interested in this? How do I ask faculty to get involved in working students through this experience? And this is the challenge that I face. So David alluded to a new building, which creates a kind of a more of an interdisciplinary structure. But the real thing is, how does this come back to you as an audience? How does the art school find an audience for this? And how do the students that come out of that art school respond to the different opportunities that are presented? And so that's one of the things that is really difficult about some of the things that I have to do. And so I think the interesting thing about this is that Winnipeg is an extraordinary opportunity for this to take place. It has graduated a lot of really interesting artists. And what I look forward to in coming here from a place like Vancouver is the opportunity, in a sense, to kind of construct something different, look for a new model of how this can integrate. And that's one of the challenges that I think I've been working on. I think one of the extraordinary things about making and looking is that if you are involved in the creative disciplines, you know what that struggle is. If you're an audience member, these are challenges. And so I think the real thing that we try to do in the art school is to find really interesting ways to create this risk-taking, this experimentation, this flipping up and down and inside and out of all the different things, using these as models and realizing that the background to this is the social landscape that we all live in. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is George Tolles, Distinguished Professor of Literature and Film at the University of Manitoba and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a very prestigious honor. George has published extensively on literary, film, and theater topics. He also regularly directs plays for professional and university theater groups. For 25 years, he has collaborated with Guy Maddin as a screenwriter. He's written or co-written screenplays for most of his feature films. He's also collaborating with Winnipeg artist Cliff Ayland on a book of illustrated mini-narratives with the working title Status Updates. Please welcome George Tolles.
Thank you. A friend reminded me that people look for a couple of takeaway points from a short presentation, so I decided to put them right at the front, lest I run out of time and they get lost in the whirlwind of my flailing arms. First, a life lived with art in mind might itself be a kind of art. Michael Kimmelman. Second, and better, I think, the beautiful is a promise of happiness, Stendhal. And finally, contradiction is a test of reality, Simone Weil. Instead of talking about literal communities in relation to art tonight, I thought I'd talk about imagined community or communities of feeling. I'd like to put another turn of the screw on the perhaps overfamiliar topic of empathy in art. It still seems to me rather mysterious how empathy works in experience and how literary and film narrative, to cite only two large examples, engender it. In his recent book, Thinking of Others, Ted Cohen argues that the ability to imagine oneself as another person is an indispensable human capacity, as essential as to moral awareness as it is to literary appreciation, and that this talent for identification is the same as a talent for metaphor. To be able to see oneself as another real or fictional personage is to exercise the ability to deal with metaphors and other figurative language. Now, one of Cohen's examples is taken from the second book of Samuel. It involves the prophet Nathan's encounter with David after David has had Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, killed in battle, which seemed the only alternative to preventing Uriah from learning that Bathsheba was pregnant with David's child. And Nathan tells David a story about a rich man and a poor man, and that the rich man takes from the poor man the only thing that the poor man had and loved, in this case a ewe lamb, and gave it as a meal to a wandering guest. And as David listened to Nathan, he became increasingly indignant and said that the man who has done this thing shall surely die and deserves his punishment, at which point Nathan famously turns on David and says, "Thou art the man." Now, what's remarkable about the story from Cohen's and my point of view is that David could shift from being indignant about the rich man and the fable to being able to recognize himself without receiving any new information about his own behavior with respect to Bathsheba and Uriah. David nonetheless manages to see a connection which strikes home to him. And Cohen suggests that perhaps part of his capacity to do this comes from David's being an artist himself, but that certainly does not solve the mystery. Now, the remainder of my brief talk tonight, I'm going to talk about two assignments that I regularly give in theater and film which have empathy components. The first, a theater exercise in acting for the camera, requires students to write a 3-minute speech from the point of view of a person that they either loathe or can neither understand or sympathize with. They are not allowed to do it as a send-up or a parody or a satire. It is not a critique. It is an attempt to work their way inside in a different fashion the character that the person that they've chosen, and to then, having written the speech, perform the speech for the camera and convince the spectators that they are in fact the person who has the experience that they've written for him or her. And there are interesting shifts that take place for many students in the process of doing this, especially given all the things that are taken away from them at the outset. Connections of often very surprising sorts are made. Now, my last example, there it is, taken from a film assignment on The Godfather. Each year I require my art of film students to put on the straitjacket of writing full-scale descriptions of 50 to 80 shots in sequence from a narrative film, usually a familiar narrative film, in which they're obliged to describe every detail in the images, visually and from the soundtrack and from the score. And it takes them many, many pages to do this. I proceed on the assumption that learning how to hear and see more things in film is a worthy endeavor, and that art always and only happens in the details. Now, to make the empathy connection, I'm going to need a little bit of water here, excuse me. Cottonmouth time. This is a very famous scene from The Godfather in which Michael Corleone more or less volunteers for the assignment of killing two men, Sollozzo, who has engineered a hit on his father, and Captain McCluskey in Louis' Diner in New York. And it's a Macbeth moment. Michael crosses a line irreversibly, becoming a murderer, but does it for understandable, somewhat honorable reasons. I mean, it's for the sake of saving his father's life. And students begin their work on the assignment, I think, with the assumption that Michael, in fact, has to complete the task that he has taken on, that is the primary concern of the scene. But what I'd like to see happening is, in the endless working and reworking of the details of the scenes, that we move from that face of Michael Corleone to the two victims' faces. One of them is up there, Sollozzo's face. And it is, in fact, a choice that Michael is making to kill. And as the details begin to accumulate for students within the scene, they begin to recognize that the music has dropped out of the soundtrack, and in its place is the sound of a subway running through in the background, though we never see it, which is a kind of roaring sound in Michael's head. And initially, the sound supplies just a kind of underlying tension, like the sound of the wine bottle is opened and making the squeaking sound that seems to be coming out again from the tension around the table and our certainty that Michael is about to kill. When Michael goes into the bathroom, the sound begins to be connected with the critical moment of decision making. Now this thing is about to be done. But then in an interesting sort of reversal, Michael delays his killing for reasons that at first seem very mysterious, though it's connected, in fact, with the sound of the subway. And the reason for the delay, the students eventually, and not by any means uniformly discover, is that Michael is waiting for the sound of the subway to return so that it will cover the shots that he's making, which more or less revises potentially our understanding of what Michael's murder means. People always say, oh, Michael has crossed the line here, but in fact, part of the burden of the scene is to indicate that murder's already inside him, that he's cold-blooded, that when the score suddenly comes up and begins wailing in brass as Michael flings down his revolver, he seems to be saying, I take this act and I embrace it. And in so doing, one hopes that the figure of Sollozzo and McCluskey, the victims in the scene, become more real, present, available for inspection. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker tonight is a leading authority in Canadian arts education. Francine Morin is Professor of Arts Education and Department Head for Curriculum Teaching and Learning at the University of Manitoba. She's a founding board member of the Canadian Network for Arts and Learning and past president of the Alliance for Arts Education in Manitoba. In a 2010 study of arts education in Manitoba schools, she gave educators their first comprehensive look at school arts programming in dance, drama, music, and visual arts. She's worked on a number of projects with various collaborators here in town. Please welcome Francine.
Well, thank you, David, and for allowing me to be part of this talk tonight. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the contributions that the arts make to the social and academic development of our youth. Why do our children need the arts, and what do they learn through the arts, and why are these outcomes important to their learning and to their lives? As children progress from preschools and onward through the K-12 system and into post-secondary institutions, we educate them more and more from the neck up, with emphasis on knowing with the mind. Learning can, however, be deeper, wider, more powerful with the arts, because they offer us different ways of knowing the world through an active and integration of the mind and the heart and the whole body. I'm sure that you've all felt that powerful connection, knowing something through the arts with an intimate encounter. Children need the arts to express themselves beyond verbal language. Not all meanings can take the impress of literal language. And that's the phenomenon that drives us as musicians and dancers and actors and artists. We can't put all of what we think and what we feel into words, and nor can children. Children possess many languages of learning that support their intellectual development. Words, yes, but also movement and drawing and painting and sculpture and shadow play, collage, music. To not teach the arts limits and starves children of these languages. Now, children in Manitoba are pretty fortunate because learning in the arts is guided by new, progressive curricula, conceived as living landscapes of knowledge that are depicted in those photo banners that open the slides. Children with their teachers explore essential learning areas that involve creative work, technical knowledge and skill development, cultural and historical understandings, interpretive and critical thinking. Students passionate about the arts can continue studying within a rich range of programs offered by arts groups in our community and post-secondary institutions. Our children need the arts because they foster broad dispositions and skills, a claim supported robustly in the literature. These are the habits of mind that are taught to us by the arts, such as the ability to see multiple viewpoints, to reflect, inquire, self-assess, to develop agency, to work with a team, to tolerate ambiguity. And perhaps the most valued is the ability to think creatively, a complex and intense process involving idea generation, digging deep, divergent, convergent thinking, listening to our inner voice and to the voices around us. Another habit of mind that results from arts education is the ability to make connections, whether it's making connections across disciplines, to everyday life, to politics, to popular culture, controversial issues. The arts take up life, and they take up the world as their content, and therefore they really should be at the very heart of all educative experience. And while some might view the arts as the light side of the curriculum, I do not. The arts are weighing much more heavily in schools around the world, where they are being used as concrete foundations, as steel pillars within new approaches to school improvement and transformation. And this work is not frivolous and it's not fad. It's rooted in mounting empirical research evidence showing us that students who participate in arts education show better outcomes in a variety of areas than their peers who do not. Now, some educators are reluctant to justify the arts on these bases, but I argue that these are the positive impacts and consequences of an arts in education, and they're just potent elements of what learning in the arts is all about. Our children need the arts because they provide a pathway to engage with social issues and the worlds of others, as George was talking about. The arts have this communicative power. They can enlighten, they can enliven, they can lift our spirits, but also they can disrupt and provoke and shock and unsettle us. Artworks that we study in education are not always benign or pretty or trivial or cute. They are interpretive texts that can be studied to establish those important links between self and other, links that engender those two critical learnings, compassion and empathy. Students can also use artistic tools to examine matters of concern and to challenge unjust social dynamics. The arts give students a voice for making a difference and the means to imagine a different reality. Finally, the arts help children develop as individuals. The arts don't homogenize. Kids don't have to look the same or be the same or do the same. Personal development is a central hallmark of the arts. They hone diversity and individuality. When we look at children today, that heterogeneous garden of young faces across the the diversity spectrum, whether the kids are advantaged or disadvantaged socially, economically, physically, academically, emotionally. Arts programs are portals that open up life possibilities, and all students can journey through them. Across Canada and across the globe, Manitoba is known as a community of great repute in arts and culture. And in my view, we are well positioned to be explorers and creators, trailblazers and innovators who can reposition the arts at the core of education, one that prepares a new generation to create a vibrant, hopeful, and better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists. So now it's time for our conversation. I'm sure that there are comments or questions that many of you will have. If you can indicate by raising your hand, one of my colleagues will find you with a microphone, and we'll begin right behind you, Chris.
As a student of U of M, I'd probably be talking to Professor Tolles, since I've seen The Godfather at least 100 times. But I'm actually here as the citizen chair for the City of Winnipeg Museums Board. And I'll take this opportunity to ask each of the panelists, where do you feel that museums fit into this idea of arts? And for that matter, do we owe it to society to sort of extend that Venn diagram so that we're not just talking about arts, we're talking about arts and culture and entertainment, that an artist that pictures a loo in 1917 should be talked in the same breath as the experience that you have at the MTS Center with the Jets.
Across? Jeff?
I went to a Jets game last night, so I'm well equipped to answer this question, I think. I'll try not to be long-winded on this one. I think the challenge faced by all of our cultural institutions, be they museums, art galleries, the BAM Center, is we have built institutions around certain assumptions in terms of human and physical resources. And one of the challenges and opportunities for us now is to reimagine those things. And part of the lecture I did earlier today, I talked about the notion of being functionally fixed. Like we're so attached to that particular platform, that method of delivery, that we're not, I think, as good as we should be about reimagining these spaces. So I think what's really, the question to flip back to you potentially and to the audience is, what is a museum? What could it be? And in light of how the society is changing, do we need to sort of reimagine the curatorial process to be more engaging, to think about community engagement in a more profound way in terms of how we use that physical infrastructure?
That's a very good question. Musicians spend most of their waking hours working on music by dead composers. We study the music of the great composer, artists, performers, and we are constantly faced with the challenge of breathing new life into that old music. And museums, of course, are synonymous with history. And what's happening in some areas of contemporary music, for example, you can have a re-imaging of a famous piece of music. There are opportunities, I believe, to create and to use some of those same processes that we use in music to apply to the concept of the museum, the underlying concept of history, redefining what a museum is, redefining its relevancy to modern society. And I believe there are huge opportunities there in music as a performing art to create those kinds of linkages.
What I learned from Glenn Gould was that you could take a 400-year-old piece of music and rethink it in a way that challenged the assumptions of the time in which it was rethought, and do two things. Remember what it might have been like then, project back, and project forward, and think of how exciting it is to listen to this in real time going forward. And so for me, the idea of a museum and the idea of a cultural house is like the Jets stadium. I used to go to a lot of rock concerts at Maple Leaf Gardens, which doesn't exist. And I was fascinated because I had been, as a child, there as watching the Leafs play. So I think the point is that they are full of really interesting stuff. They are capable of a variety of things. It's kind of like more a matter of, as Jeff has articulated, trying to turn it into something where it can be extremely flexible. It can take on different guises, chameleon-like in a sense, because it needs to serve many functions. And I stress the one, I think, interesting thing about the museum, which is akin to the stadium and to the Jets Arena, the MTS Center, and that is that it can be one thing for one weekend and something different the next day, and that can last a week, but then it can change again. And I think that flexibility is key to the survival of a museum in whichever context, and that can include all these other venues as well.
I know you directed your question to all five, and I'm sure the other two have views, but just in the interest of engaging with more questions, we'll move on and let you talk to them afterwards. Are there others with questions or comments? Here in the middle, I think. Chris, can you get to Jeff?
There's an interesting perspective, I think, in Canada and the United States. We talk about arts as the foundation of a vibrant community. I think overseas, in quite a few countries, Canada specifically is thought of as everybody here is an artist in some way or another. But within Canada, we almost have this embarrassment about what we are and how we are as artists. We almost have a very provincial view of ourselves and apologetically perform and paint and play music. And I just wonder to anybody on the panel, how you think we've evolved into this kind of almost proletariat approach, that it's gentrified, it's elitist, it's all this kind of thing, yet it's practiced by almost everybody in this room and everybody in the country.
Volunteers, George?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question in the spirit in which it's offered. I think embarrassment is a good thing to have about your relationship to art, whatever it is. That it certainly serves me better than pride or tub thumping. I mean, I feel that the uncertainty of ever being up to the task, unsure whether something is in fact any good, feeling that you're in the dark as you're doing it. I'm not sure that a raising up of the rhetoric that goes with being an artist necessarily enhances the process of making art. But anyway, that I'm more than willing to hear other views on this matter.
Dare anyone?
Process. I'm not sure if it's embarrassment or humility, and humility can be a great thing, because I know as a performing musician, when I'm learning music, I have the privilege of working on a piece of music that's far better than I could ever hope to be. And it's an incredible challenge, it's an incredible privilege, but yet when you perform it, performing is larger than life. So you're always walking that balance between communicating this great work of art to an audience, but at the same time you realize in the back of your mind, as I said, that piece is bigger than you could ever hope to be. So there's always the sense that you're trying to climb Mount Everest or whatever. So I like to think of it more in being related to humility and having a good work ethic, because it doesn't matter how much you work at it, the piece is never finished. So there's a balance between going for it on the one hand and realizing on the other how incredibly wonderful this music is and what a privilege it is to learn it. I don't know if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts. Because consistently there is so much great music making across this country from coast to coast. It's really incredible.
I think, Jeff, it depends on, I'm a tub thumper, so we'll have a difference of opinion here, but I think it depends on what part of the arts sector you're talking about. One of my pet peeves around our nation in terms of how we create arts and culture is we have spent the last 60 years building out cultural infrastructure that everybody else has. So the whole Massey Commission, 49 to 51, trying to prove Canada's not a backwater by building what Europe had. And I think we're now at a point in our country where it really has to be about distinctive Canadian content and Canadian artistic leadership on the world stage, which is totally tub thumping. But I think we're ready for that now, and there are examples. Cirque du Soleil. You look at our indie rock musicians internationally. We are creating indigenous approaches to artistic practice that are really relevant and important. And I think parts of our sector have been locked in this model of trying to catch up to Europe. And the reality is we can't compete on the basis of direct competition with countries that have hundreds of years of legacy around some of those artistic forms and practice.
Francine?
I think certainly with young children, we're trying to instill in them a sense of identity, and we find when they are working extensively with the arts that they are in fact developing very high sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy, and so I think we need to engender some of those feelings from a very young age.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Chris? Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. I find the very first comment made was quite intriguing, that art sector should be about risk-taking. I run a dance company of dancers who know in classical Indian dance, and they bend backwards to create dance dramas every year. 20 years since then. I have supported that because I have always felt I appreciated the love they have for the dance, but never thought about the risk they are taking every time. True, any artist who comes, learns a dance or a very difficult art form, and wanting to learn in an environment which may not particularly appreciate it, they are taking a risk right away. And then staging it, going through the tremendous amount of work involved in the midst of various other factors in creating something and wanting that to be appreciated. So I thought the point you made about risk-taking is particularly significant. And the question is, since I myself didn't appreciate that as much as the love they had for the dance, and I support that, what can we do to appreciate that and send that sense of appreciation to those dancers? I think all those artists are young people and old people like me, all of us. I think we owe that to the dancers and the musicians and all these artists. Not just the financial support, which of course is always good, but what are the various other ways a visible support extended to the very act of risk-taking?
Sure.
For some reason, I tend to gravitate to financial support more often than I should. So you frame that in a way that's challenging. I think what I think about with risk-taking, actually, frankly, I think anytime anyone gets up as an artist of any type or presents a work, they're sharing something that is so profound and human and vulnerable that we should value it. And I personally think, and people will disagree, but the notion of the aesthetic divide where our role as an audience is judging works of art, I think that's just wrong. I think as a starting point, it's wrong. Down the road, sure, of course, you want that kind of distinctive approach to things. But I think encouraging people to develop new works, to enter, people are talking about entering upon novelty as an approach, is really critical. And whether that means supporting young dancers in the risks they might take in a studio. And of course, people don't recognize dancers' careers are short. They're doing a lot to their body in terms of expressing themselves and paying a huge physical toll to do something they love. Reinforcing that with dancers, but also as artists, choreographers are creating new works, really creating that safe space for people to take risks, to try things. And my personal bias is I'd rather see arts organizations fail doing something bold and courageous than succeed doing something mediocre. And I think that's a different sort of approach and something we really need to think about seriously in Canadian arts and culture.
2 weeks ago, I saw this phrase in the Globe and Mail. It said something like Harper, Hortons, and hockey. And it struck me that that's one of the problems, is how media and how reporting sets up a kind of to use a quote about Steve Jobs, a reality distortion field. In other words, it's kind of like, this isn't really what it is, but this is what we're going to tell you it's like. And I think the difficulty right now is that there is not enough good, thoughtful, and curiosity-based writing about all kinds of the events that are taking place that are right across the country, in every city, in every town, and so on, at every different arts level. And so I think that there needs to be a greater development of the critical writing that goes on. That's one thing. But I want to flip back to the problem of what goes on in the art school, because this risk-taking thing is really extraordinary. You have people that are not professionals, who are not fully trained, whether it's in music or in art or dance and theater, who are learning what this is. And the old atelier model, the old apprenticeship model, is not there anymore. So that without that, it's hard for them to move through the 10 or so years it takes to get confident. So this question that you raise is very interesting. You're dealing with a professional company, and the commitment is there. What I'm dealing with and I'm thinking about is, how do you create the sense of commitment? How do you create the sense of risk-taking? And what that means is that in the studio, at least from my context, or from, say, the practice studio in the music context, is you have to create confidence in the individual that's trying it. The risk-taking is connected to this idea that you must create a level of comfort around that isn't going to be criticized, meaning that they're going to be embarrassed and feel awkward, and then the fear sets in, the defensiveness sets in. So you're kind of going back to this question that Francine raised about the problem of the child and the nurturing. It's got to be in a nurturing environment where risk-taking can flourish. But I will say this, it doesn't last for a long time. The best art schools, the best music schools are a fuse that's lit and burns out. So all of our institutions that we think about have not been around forever and have not enjoyed the popularity or the fame forever. It's very hard to keep that going. It's not just money, but it is, the money is important. But what I'd say is it's enough money to get the right people to get that energy going and to sustain that. And that's a human commitment. And I think it's a difficult one to sustain over a long period of time. Absolutely. I agree with all those thoughts, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just looking at the title for our talk today, The Arts Foundation of a Vibrant Community. And if we really embrace that as a community, I'm thinking that we are assuming that vibrant is a good thing and that the arts could be a foundation of that, and without that foundation it would in fact fall down. What would it mean in Winnipeg if we as a community truly embraced that the arts were the foundation of creating the kind of dynamism that we're looking for?
George, do you want to start?
A friend of mine mentioned before the talks began tonight that it's interesting comparing the visionary conversation titles for other realms with art. And he said it's interesting how provocative and specific all of the other questions were, but when we get down to arts, what do you get? 3 cheers for the vibrant community. And it's this kind of vague, it's human rights. It's something that we can all get behind, but I worry that it's so easy for the content to leak out of the terminology before we've even begun to address the issues. And I feel the same way about the phrase risk-taking. I mean, every pundit on the air is talking about risk-taking. I mean, you can't walk 10 feet without hitting someone who's applauding somebody for taking risks. And are these risks that people are taking? How do we know? I mean, what is a real risk or a sense of risk? I mean, you like to say, of course I'm taking risks, but in fact I may be running the numbers in things that may have been riskier 5 years ago and are now my settled habits of mind. And I'm living off the interest of a time when I was making something that actually pushed me rather than allowed me to do what I know how to do. So I would just say that in all of the language that we use in art, we have to, I think, caution ourselves against a kind of, yes, the hockey crowd knows why they're excited, and we're saying, well, we should be just as excited about art, but if we aren't excited in the same way, there isn't a whole hell of a lot we can do about it. I mean, sorry to be the skeptic here. I don't know.
I actually thought you were excited.
Michael?
Any other comments on that?
I think the challenge we face is that we're in a profession that deals with so many intangibles, you know. But when I go back to that story I told about my mother in December, that how can she, with dementia at the age of 81, remember every word and note of a song that she heard when she was 19 that I've never heard her sing? There are intangibles and there are tangibles. My two bookend quotes, 380 BC and in the year 2006, have we really come that far? I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, but I think there are huge things for us in the future, and I think so often I find myself having to find these, like the quick wins, like to support, to promote what we're doing. I think there's an incredible foundation in this community to build upon, but I think in many ways, I've only been here 6 years, but in many ways I think it's just starting. But that's the sort of incubator that I think we potentially have here. But it's a challenge because you're dealing with these intangibles, but they're very important and becoming more and more clear.
Thanks.
I'm a visitor and an outsider. I'm from Los Angeles, and I do a radio program there called Bookworm. I've been doing it for 25 years. It's on National Public Radio. What I see in front of me, and I haven't attended many of these kinds of things, I stay away from them because, no, not to be funny. It's very easy to laugh when what we face is something unlaughable. We talk about visionary right now at a moment of such extraordinary, talk about risk-taking, progress, that what we need to talk about is what our conventions are. What do we rely on? When Paul talks about teaching the students what this thing is, how do we get them to enjoy something strange, like an inverted urinal, and to see that it can be considered art from a certain perspective? My question would be more, how can that be part of the continuity that includes Michelangelo or includes the biblical story of David and Bathsheba, that constantly the frame of reference shrinks to the visionary moment when what we need, especially in a university, is the continuous moment, the continuity of tradition that says that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow were part of yesterday, and that we do not have to become conservative in order to say so. So I want to ask you, in this mood of risk-taking, how often have you spoken to one another? Because what I see are 6 very different people whom I suspect have never engaged in conversation together. And what could possibly come out of that demonstration of 7 minutes of this person doing the fundraising shtick and George doing his extraordinary gift for sensitivity and finding empathy in the different, and a parade of the avant-garde, and a man whose climax comes with a tender moment with his mother? Where does the risk, or the young children, beautifully photographed, doing art, where does the risk of saying things to one another enter in a public event? And that, not the arts, that conversation would be the foundation of a vibrant community, not a vague subject matter that brings you all up there. We've all been educated in our fields. Of course we can speak for 7 minutes. Can we speak to each other after years and years of growing used to not speaking to each other? Can such a thing happen?
Who wants to respond to that? Okay. Paul?
Interesting points, and the laughing wasn't laughing, really. It was an acknowledgement reaction to what I think is an interesting problem. Edmund and I have spent, for as long as I've been here, because he preceded me by 1 year, talking regularly and at length about a range of different things. But sure, I haven't been at Banff since Jeff has been there. I've been to Banff several times and done residencies. So I mean, your point is taken. But I would back up a little bit and go back to your comment from the point of view that I think is what goes on in the art school and other art schools that I know nationally or North America-wide. And that is that in every studio class that goes on, in every art history class that goes on, there is a constant dialogue that takes place. It's nonverbal in a lot of cases because the making is nonverbal. But with what it is, and I call it, it's practice-based education. You do something, you make something, you transform something, or you interact with materials and processes. And then you spend the rest of your time in a dialogue with it and you, and with your peers and with others. And so the amount of information that comes out of that is what links you back and forth. Art is a matter of precedent, or is it a matter of novelty? You know, does it come from nowhere, or does it come from precedent? And it really does come from precedent. The only way that any of the stuff that I showed, and I just picked things at random because I knew they would be either interesting for personal reasons, or maybe people knew about them and would comment, or they were just, what is that point of view? And there's a lot of omissions. But in every case, it's possible to spend, well, 7 minutes is kind of absurd, I would agree. Artists talk way too long anyway, right? I mean, we could go on forever. But the point is that the dialogue is there, and it's always a reference of touchstones, back and forth and back and forth. It's very fluid. So, I mean, the earlier question about what makes a vibrant community, I would have said, just show up. Just show up. You know, go somewhere. Go to the opera. Go to a gallery. Go to a concert. Go to the mall. Critique the mall. You know, why are we in the mall? It's horrible. I mean, go outside. It's bloody cold out. I mean, there's a constant amount of sensory information. You're always taking it in. And I think that kind of stuff is the kind of stuff that fuels this back and forth, whether it's in the studio or not. And so I'd say, just show up. Something's going to happen. And that's almost a lift off a Chuck Close quote, which is, you know, it's imposters show up, the rest of us just show up and get to work. You know, amateurs need inspiration. Artists just show up and get to work. So I mean, it's that kind of a thing.
Francine?
I think universities are places that, quite frankly, we are very highly specialized and we are all in different sorts of units. But I think one of the wonderful things about the arts is, in fact, that they do invite conversation, and that people from different art forms, different departments, different units do offer different perspectives on things. In fact, just last evening, there were a group of us from a variety of departments at the university here where we were talking about the possibility of interdisciplinary programming among units. And I mean, certainly we find this in, for example, my work with Manitoba Education, where we have brought teachers representing different art forms together. And those conversations are not always easy. In terms of what is the best arts education going to look like for young people. But I think, you know, that the fact that the arts beg interpretation, they invite people to have conversations who see things in different ways. In fact, they can encourage interdisciplinary thinking in some ways.
George, last word?
I'm glad to be embarrassed again and say, though I've had a conversation with Francine, Michael has me dead to rights. I've never conversed for a moment with 3 of the people on the stage. I regret that. But I think something that needs to be maybe mentioned is that academics have to fight against the fact that so many of us are socially maladroit, that we became academics in part to teach, but maybe more to be left alone. Though I'm trying to cure myself of this.
That's why you're here. That's the cure.
Chris? Two more questions.
My name is Harry Payne, and I'm from the Arts and Disability Network for Manitoba, and I would just like to raise that issue, the issue of art and disability. Recently, there was a review of the Nobu concert in the Free Press, and it was a really great review. However, there was one part of it in which the Nobu was described in the extent of his disability didn't affect his performance. And I would just like to say that I believe that one of the things that we are now experiencing is a whole new form of art, which I think is that which is of the people who have disabilities. There are larger numbers of disabled people in the community, and their art is not affected, it is effected by their disability. And I would just like you to say, to bring that into your teaching and to recognize that there is a whole new form of art out there, and we as an organization try to facilitate that in a best way. And the problem we have is that a lot of artists don't want to be tested by their disability. They want to be tested by their art. And so there is this kind of conversation going on. And I would like to see that raised in the art community. And I would just like to say that I would like to thank the panelists for one of the most stimulating discussions that I've heard in a long time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that contribution. Does anyone want to respond to that? Okay, seems good. I know that there are additional questions, but I feel quite strongly, since we made a commitment to be done by 1:30, people will have other obligations, and I want to let those who need to leave, and I'm sure the panelists would be willing to talk. So I'm going to ask Pat Bovey, Vice Chair of the Board, and well known to members of the local arts community, to tell us what the core of the issue is.
What a challenge. Well, we've heard, and I think everybody in this room knew that the arts are absolutely fundamental to who we are as individuals and what we are as a society and as a community. I love going back to Plato and the harmony and the rhythm. I love the challenges of the disruptive change that we are in today and have been in centuries before, as we take a look at how our society is changing and what our roles might be. We've heard the word imagining and, dare I say again, risk-taking in a variety of contexts. We've heard imagining, we've heard reimagining. We've heard the word continuity. And I believe our artists, as Edmund and as Paul has said and as George has said, do base their risk-taking on the continuity and expressions of the past and reinventing them, reimagining them, repurposing them for contemporary society. I want to just quote a couple of people. John Ralston Saul, as you all know, has written about culture being the motor of any successful society. And anything that has a motor keeps on going. And I believe it's our role to make sure that this society keeps on going in a reimagined, expressive, positive way, which questions, which challenges. It was just, 18 months ago that Winnipeg celebrated its being Canadian culture capital of Canada. And one of our speakers talked about the 4 pillars of sustainable societies, the culture pillar being one of those 4, and thus a very strong foundation. In closing, I guess I want to say, as we face a challenge, and we do have to think out of the box, we are a collaborative city, and this city has thought out of the box since the time prior to its becoming incorporated as a city in 1873. It was the citizens here who wanted Winnipeg to be the Chicago of the North. And if that wasn't a visionary challenge, I don't know what one was. And as a result, Winnipeg is the proud home of the first of many arts organizations and arts expressions in this country. So we are known as a collaborative center. We are known as a imaginative center. And I believe, building on that continuity, we do have the foundation to do the risk-taking that we need to do to be the kind of community we want to be. And my very last comment, I'm going to quote Sir Brian McMaster, who was the author of the 2008 British Arts Review, Policy Review, Study Review, and I love the first sentence, which I can't quote verbatim because I didn't think I'd use it tonight, but the first sentence in his final comment, his final conclusion is that the public of Great Britain are hungry for artistic excellence and artistic risk-taking, and I think that's what we're hungry for here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks very much for those comments. I want to remind those of you who are regulars, and for those of you who are new, invite you back. Our next visionary conversation will be on our Bannatyne campus, Wednesday, April 17th, and we'll be talking about the possibility of global pandemics, fitting that that's going to be on the Health Sciences campus. So we'd love you to join us again at 6:30 for reception and 7 o'clock for the session. I want to thank all of the panelists tonight. I want to thank all of you who are in the audience. We have a large group of people who return regularly to these visionary conversations, and some who come specifically for the topics. There's just a wonderful audience tonight of people who are artists, people who are managing arts organizations, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm sure the conversation could have gone on much longer. Thank you very much.